Those of you who are still trying to pick your perfect seat, now is the time. So good evening and welcome to those of you here in the room and those of you who are watching on our live stream or who are watching it later. Welcome again to Grace Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Carolyn Hetrick. We're in the fourth week of our series, Ecology of Grace, here at Grace Lutheran. Next week is our last week. And in the meantime, before we get to all of that and tonight's speaker, for those of you here in the room, in case you do not know or need to be reminded, hospitality notes. If you need a restroom or a water fountain, you go back out the doors, you hang a left, you keep going, and on the right-hand side, you will find those things. So as you know, we've been exploring the practice of ecology and how we relate to one another in the created world that God has given us, and specifically, as people of faith, how we do that from a perspective of grace. And we've had just wonderful speakers up until now, and we're going to be blessed with more of the same. Last week we got to hear about no pressure, right? Last week we got to hear about the ecology and grace of the Arboretum. The weather is absolutely perfect right now. If you haven't been out there, please go. And if you really want the super secret tour, see Sandy Hall. She's the queen of the children's garden, and she will gladly show you all of the secret things. It's really amazing. But in the meantime, tonight we have Dr. Charlie Vasey, who is Professor and Associate Head of Research and Faculty Success in the Department of Biology at Penn State. That is a very long title. Yes, and he's going to share with us his perspectives on how we can reflect God's grace and circularity, seeing the things that come around in a circle, sort of like our communion rail does here on Sundays, right? Interconnectedness and resilience that we see in nature and that we can see in our lives as we build beneficial and sustaining spaces. That's called bioeconomics, which is beyond my field, but I like to say the word because it makes me sound intelligent. But I think in this world in which we find ourselves, where there is so much noise, it is really something to gather and ground ourselves in what is beneficial and sustaining and what is filled with grace and beauty. It certainly sounds different, right, than survival of the fittest or a world that we're told to imagine that we really are not all sacred to God. So, with that, I give you Dr. Charlie Vasey.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Pastor Hetrick, I'm pretty sure, for organizing this amazing series and inviting me to be a part of it. So you have heard 3 amazing speakers. We'll see if this one is any good. Some of you might know me as Dr. Charles Anderson, Professor of Biology at Penn State, and some of you know me as Charlie Vasey. I'm a member here at Grace Lutheran who occasionally sings during worship with a very deep voice, and who has an amazing wife, Adrienne, and a wonderful son and daughter, Quinn and Blythe, who have very long blonde hair, unlike me, and they serve as acolytes during worship service. But I am, in fact, the same person, Charlie Anderson, Charlie Vasey. It's just that I use Anderson as my last name professionally, whereas Vasey is my married last name. It's wonderful to be with you all today and to talk about the ecology of grace. So I will preface my talk today by emphasizing that I am not a theologian, although my grandfather was a professor of theology, so no pressure. The last course that I took on the Bible was during the completion of my undergraduate degree at UNC Chapel Hill, which I will not say how many years ago that was. That also happens to be where Reverend Dr. Chad Rimmer completed his undergraduate degree in biology, so he spoke a few weeks ago. I am a little bit apprehensive about speaking in this series since I'm not a theologian and it falls a little bit outside my sphere of expertise, but I will venture a bit outside my comfort zone and do my very best to talk to you today about the intersection between my faith and my work as a scientist and a member of the community. So professionally, I am a biologist who studies plants, and I explore how they grow and develop and how they can be used to help build sustainable and productive bioeconomies. And I promise I will define that term. But we hope that these bioeconomies will sustain humanity and the planet for many years and millennia to come. However, more importantly than being a scientist, I am a husband and a dad and a Christian. And I think a lot about how our work, inspired and sustained by faith, can help make the world a better place for every living thing. So what is a sustainable bioeconomy? The United Nations defines sustainability as living in such a way that allows future generations to thrive. And as Christians, I think we think a lot about the future. We also think about the past. We live in the now, and it's up to us to make the now as sustainable as possible. What is a bioeconomy? I define a bioeconomy as a system of life that sustains life, that is all about growing new life. So keep those definitions in mind as we go through. Even though I am a professor, there will be no quiz at the end, so you don't have to worry about that. So although I am a scientist and have studied science since I was growing up, I'm still amazed by the fact that sunlight, the product of violent nuclear fusion reactions happening inside a giant ball of gas that's about 150 million kilometers away, is the main driver of the cycles of life on Earth. Each day, our planet is bathed in enough sunlight to provide many times the amount of all the energy humanity currently uses. Just think of that amazing abundance the next time you walk outside and feel the sun's warmth on your face, even though it is getting a little crisp in the fall. Plants, which I happen to study, use a small percentage of the energy provided by sunlight to power the process of photosynthesis, in which they absorb carbon dioxide from the air through tiny pores on their leaves called stomata. So one of the topics of my research at Penn State is understanding how stomata open in response to stimuli like light, and how they close at night to conserve water for the plant. It's a very exciting field of biomechanics, which I will not get into here because I don't have PowerPoint slides to show you. But if you want to talk to me about that, I'd love to talk to you all day about stomata. After imbibing this carbon dioxide, the plants perform light-driven chemical reactions to break apart water molecules that they ultimately transport up from their roots to their leaves, and they break those water molecules into their components, hydrogen and oxygen. It just so happens that the oxygen that plants produce, we need to survive. We breathe in oxygen that plants make. We also generate carbon dioxide that plants use. And ultimately, the product of photosynthesis is, if you remember back to your biology classes in, let's say, high school or your undergraduate career, sugars. Okay, I'm going to ask my one question, my one Socratic style question for this talk, which is, does anyone know why plants are green rather than some other color? I'm hearing whispers of chlorophyll. So chlorophyll, which is one of the main pigments in plants that absorbs sunlight, absorbs a lot of red light and a lot of blue light, but not so much green light, which is in the middle of the spectrum. And those plants reflect green light back out so we can see that beautiful green, verdant color that many plants have. Another fun fact is that in the fall, as plants start to lose their chlorophyll, they reveal other pigments, xanthophylls and beta-carotenes and all sorts of other pigments. And that's why we see that rainbow of colors happening in the autumn, especially in places like State College. Okay, out of professor mode, back into talking about the ecology of grace. So after carrying out photosynthesis, plants then transform some of the simple sugars that they make into tough but flexible cell walls, of which their bodies are built. Did you know that Robert Hooke, one of the first microscopists, and I count myself as a microscopist as well, defined cells as what they look like based on the fact that they looked like a religious thing, which was the small rooms at which monks at monasteries lived. So we scientists owe our definition of cells to Robert Hooke's knowledge of religious practice back in the 1600s. Plant cells spin some of the sugars that they make into something called cellulose, which, despite being made of glucose, which is a very soluble and available sugar, has the same strength as steel. So if you pull on cellulose, it has the same strength as steel. It spins other sugars into pectins that help plant cells stick together, kind of like the jelly in a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And that's one of the topics that I study in my own research. And it spins still other molecules that it makes from those sugars into a compound called lignin, which is a waterproof compound that protects wood from degradation and attack. So this is all part of a wondrous biological process by which a mustard seed, like the one Jesus uses as a simile for the kingdom of heaven in his parable in Matthew chapter 13, grows from a tiny, insignificant object into a large plant, the greatest of shrubs, which to me is kind of a hilarious statement, right? It's saying you're the tallest basketball player under 5 feet tall. But the greatest of shrubs, the mustard, has birds that nest in its branches. And it made this transformation by converting carbon dioxide from the air, plus a few mineral nutrients from the soil, while consuming water from the ground that it transported up its stem into its mature form using energy from sunlight. And thus, we can witness the astounding results of the slow building over centuries of things like groves of giant redwood trees that reach as tall as a cathedral. My wife, Adrienne, and I were lucky enough to be married in such a redwood grove out in California by the pastor of another Grace Lutheran church in Palo Alto. So we moved from Palo Alto to State College, and we stuck with Grace Lutheran as our church in both locations. At a more human scale, and to build on Reverend Dr. Gil Wald-Koenig's comments from his presentation a few weeks ago, you are currently sitting on wooden pews that were constructed by craftsmen from timber that was composed of those transformed sugars initially made and captured decades ago by living trees using sunlight, air, and water. Although wood is quite sturdy, many of the other materials that plants generate are consumed by animals, fungi, and bacteria, which break those materials down again into their component sugars and transform them using the process of cellular respiration in their mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, as many of you probably remember, back into water and carbon dioxide. Some of my current research at Penn State involves using a custom-built microscope to watch the tiny enzymes that clip sugars off cellulose, the most abundant biomolecule on planet Earth, that again happens to be made entirely out of glucose, move along like tiny caterpillars as they chew through the cellulose and carry out this molecular deconstruction. One of the interesting and slightly frustrating things we've learned in our research is that when most of these enzyme molecules encounter cellulose, they sit down and bind to the cellulose, but they don't do a whole lot. They just kind of sit there. And the ones that do move work very slowly, releasing tiny amounts of sugar at a time. So you might thinking about natural selection and the pressures of evolution, that evolution might select for enzymes that move incredibly fast. However, this phenomenon provides us with a clue that these cellulose-degrading tiny enzymes might have evolved to provide just enough sugar to the fungi that produce those enzymes to enable the fungus to grow, produce spores, and complete its own life cycle. So the bioeconomies that exist across nature can sometimes work over very short timescales. One of my favorites is the Venus flytrap, right, which can close in a fraction of a second and capture an insect inside it. That insect then provides nutrients back to the plant. So carnivorous plants are another awesome topic of plant biology that one of my colleagues at Penn State studies. If you're ever interested, come talk to me and I'll introduce you to them. But at other times, these bioeconomies can happen over very long timescales, like a bracket fungus, for instance, decomposing a fallen log over decades. Of course, we humans, in trying to build new bioeconomies, would like these cellulose-degrading enzymes to work faster, to be able to convert cellulose into useful products like second-generation biofuels that don't compete with food production. But making them do so has proven to be quite tricky. It turns out that overriding 400 million years of adaptation by plants to resist being broken down by organisms like animals and fungi is no easy task. So despite challenges like these, we scientists and engineers are trying to use things like cellulose itself as an integral part of the emerging bioeconomy. We already use cellulose, and we have for hundreds or thousands of years, to make things like clothing and paper. But cellulose is now being used to make advanced medical devices, for instance, that are enhancing human health. So I would ask, what else can human ingenuity create from plants, which are master metabolic factories that could be part of a new and sustainable bioeconomy? So getting back to a cycle for a moment, the entire cycle of carbon between plants, which are producers in an ecological sense, and animals, fungi, and bacteria, which are ecologically consumers and also decomposers, happens on a massive scale. Over 150 billion metric tons of carbon are absorbed by plants across the planet every year. We can actually see this in signatures of atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. It's almost like the planet breathes in carbon dioxide every summer and breathes some of it out every winter. A large portion of this carbon is in fact released back into the atmosphere by the process of cellular respiration in the mitochondria I mentioned earlier. And this cycle is ultimately powered by plants that sip a small portion of sunlight, which, as I mentioned earlier, represents a massive amount of energy shining over our planet. Considering this cycle and how it is powered makes me sometimes think about how much grace God provides to us to honor him, to be thoughtful and industrious stewards of his creation, and to do good in the world. I would hypothesize that to sustain ourselves in faith, we might only need to absorb a small fraction of it. In biology, we also study the interconnections that exist in nature across energy, across space, across species, and across time. I've already touched on how plants and animals and fungi transmit energy through the carbon cycle. Regarding connections through time, scientists have cataloged over 300,000 unique species of plants, all of which likely descended along a highly branched evolutionary tree from a single common ancestor, a single-celled organism that engulfed a photosynthetic bacterium over 1 billion years ago and gained the power to make its own food with a little help from sunlight. The interconnectedness across time of all plant species and ultimately all life that we appreciate in biology can be reflected in the grace and love we experience in our own family trees. So I happen to be one of 28 grandchildren, descended from 7 siblings who grew up in Delaware. And last weekend I traveled with my own children, Quinn and Blythe, to the home of one of those siblings, my great, and I mean really great, Aunt Amy Sloan. Aunt Amy was born in 1919, was also a graduate of UNC Chapel Hill, go Tar Heels, with a degree in history rather than biology, but that's okay. History is informative too. And Aunt Amy demonstrated an intense curiosity throughout her life, becoming a teacher and also a professional sculptor. I visited her often at her farm on the banks of an estuary when I went to Rehoboth Beach for summer vacations growing up. And that happened every year from birth through the age of 30, partly because my grandmother also lived in Rehoboth. Aunt Amy lived to be 101. She died on the very last day of 2020, and she lived a very long and fruitful and happy life. So this past Saturday, when I walked from the pier behind her house, where I was able to show my kids where I used to catch blue crabs out of the estuary, and also once fell into the estuary trying to catch the blue crabs, as a kid myself, I was walking to the back porch where I visited and talked about all sorts of topics with Aunt Amy growing up. Over several decades, I felt her benevolent presence. And it made me wonder how experiences like that childhood crab catching might have sparked my own curiosity into how nature works. The connections that we share across time with our ancestors and with our family members, and the grace and love that they provide us through family stories and human connection, like captured sunlight, empower each of us to develop and pursue our own paths. I hope I will be able to transmit some of the grace I inherited from my dear Aunt Amy to my own children, and maybe someday grandchildren, and maybe someday great-grandchildren, maybe also great-great-grandchildren, which she had at the end of her life. Like Aunt Amy and her dual career as both a teacher and a sculptor, we scientists can sometimes also channel our interests and passion into additional pursuits. For example, for the past several years, I have been able to work along with a broad community of faculty members, staff, and students at Penn State to advance our university's sustainability mission, building sustainability more fully into our educational curriculum, facilitating new research discoveries that will support sustainable economic development in Pennsylvania and beyond, and developing a plan to decarbonize the university's own activities by 2035, which is only a decade from now. This community building is its own kind of bioeconomy, I would hypothesize, wherein we must work to find common purpose with our neighbors and colleagues, navigate disagreements and political turbulence, and identify and nurture the seeds of enthusiasm that can ultimately grow and blossom into leadership and positive change. One outcome of this effort, for instance, of which I am only a very small part, is that Penn State was recently ranked second in the country and 19th in the world for sustainability among all universities. So throughout this challenging but rewarding journey, which is far from over, I have been buoyed by my own faith and by the goodwill of so many people in which I see glints of God's grace. A bioeconomy is truly a community, and it only functions as such. So finally, some of the discoveries that we make as plant biologists, both about the cycles of water, carbon, and nutrients through ecosystems, and the many products that plants generate as they adapt to challenging environments despite being stuck in place, are being put into practical use to build an emerging set of human-powered bioeconomies in which products can be generated, used, and recycled for the benefit of everyone while minimizing harm to people and the environment. I would also say that people and the environment are intertwined. We sometimes think of ourselves as separate from nature. In fact, we are a part of nature. For example, I am working with collaborators currently to determine whether we can use a specialized type of processed wood that's called superwood to build strong and resilient materials that could partly take the place of concrete. This concrete is by itself responsible for about 8% of all of humanity's greenhouse gas emissions, which are causing some issues with our climate currently. Other researchers at Penn State are working to make concrete itself more recyclable so that when beautiful buildings like this one, which is constructed partly of concrete, reach the ends of their lives, they can be recycled into new structures. Adding sustainable materials like superwood to the construction industry could potentially provide a continuous source of revenue for forest owners and forestry workers, and also construction workers in places like Pennsylvania, which happens to be 60% or so covered in forest, despite the fact that our state was almost entirely clear-cut multiple times over the past few centuries to do things like fire furnaces to produce iron, which itself, again, was an economy. It wasn't necessarily a circular or fully sustainable economy. I'm reminded by that story of things like the Lorax, right, where all the trees are cut down and the industry fades away. Wouldn't it be great if we could, in the story of the Lorax, pluck enough trefoil trees to be able to sow enough seeds, right, to be able to support a continuous economy? So similar to the growth of the Arboretum that was highlighted by Dr. Casey Sklar in last week's Ecology of Grace talk, that has happened in only 15 years. It's really amazing to think how quickly, at least in a geological sense, forests and the ecosystems they support, including our own thriving, can recover if provided with care and stewardship. And I would share with you the vision that this might happen in places like Pennsylvania, which again have abundant forest resources that have supported humanity for thousands of years and might do so for thousands more. Like the miracle of Jesus using 5 loaves and 2 fishes to feed over 5,000 people, resources like trees and grasslands can expand from small patches into enormous swaths that will sustain our spirits and our livelihoods. How can we do this, even in the face of formidable challenges? I would hope that through inspired work, sustaining faith and God's grace, together, we can accomplish this goal. I'm happy to take questions about the sustainable bioeconomy or anything about plants you would like to know. We'll wait for the microphone, sorry.
With the superwood, is it more of a treated type wood or a composite? The composite is just plastic. that has nothing to do with trees.
Right.
So it's more superwood of a super treated board. We use treated wood in Colorado as the foundation instead of concrete for a log cabin I helped build.
That's wonderful. Superwood is essentially a very specifically treated wood. So it's treated under pressure at a relatively high temperature. In some cases, it's partially treated to remove some of the lignin that I mentioned earlier. And all of that together makes the wood more compressible into a denser substance that has some similar properties to that of Kevlar. You mentioned a composite. Another research project that we're working on is actually trying to take sawdust, which is a waste product in the forestry industry, and compress that under modest temperature with water as a solvent to make something called bioconcrete. And this process was inspired by a process that was invented at Penn State called cold sintering, where researchers can take ceramic dust, essentially, ceramic particles, compress them in a solvent at modest temperature, and generate a very strong material. So we're working both on sort of superwood as maybe like a paneling or a steel beam replacement, and then this bioconcrete as potential concrete replacements in at least some applications.
Thank you for a fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it. Mine's kind of a basic question back to your early part when you were talking about sugars. And we enjoy maple syrup quite a bit. And I'm wondering, given what my understanding was of what you were saying, how have they developed, and I don't know how to ask this right, but
That's okay.
How is it that we don't kill all the maple trees when we're tapping? Is it just a small amount and over time we've learned, or how has that evolved and how are we not killing them because we really enjoy maple syrup? Thank you.
That is a great question. Do not worry if you like maple syrup, because I love it too. And you are not harming the tree if the maple syrup is harvested carefully and sustainably. So in many cases, trees and other plants transport sugars throughout their body in the form of sucrose, which is basically a dimer that contains glucose and fructose. And that sucrose is what we taste in the maple syrup. So in the wintertime, maple trees, which photosynthesize with their leaves in the summer and fall, they transport a lot of that sucrose down into their roots. Then in the spring, as we start to see these freeze-thaw cycles in the day and night, right in the early spring, the maple tree will start to transport its sucrose back up from the roots through the trunk of the tree to begin to grow buds for new leaves. And by tapping into the liquid that comes out of the maple trunk, we are taking a small portion of that transported sucrose. We are not harming the tree to the point that it will die. However, if it is over-tapped, for instance, if the entire vasculature, right, the circulatory system, if you will, of the tree is disrupted by too much tapping, or if you do something called girdling a tree, which is cutting that vasculature all the way around, the tree will die. These questions about plant biology, I got these.
Just to follow up on the maple syrup question, if the tree sends the sucrose down in the fall, why can't we tap the trees in the fall also?
Yeah, that's a good question. This is a little bit outside my expertise because I'm not a tree biologist. But my recollection from teaching this in a class that I taught a few years ago is that when it transports the sucrose back down into the roots, it also contains other compounds that make the syrup taste less good. And the concentration of that sucrose when it brings it up from the roots is a little bit higher than it when it transports it down, because it's transporting it down over the course of several months and then transporting it back up in the course of a few weeks during that early spring thaw. Nobody has any theology questions for me. I asked a theology question a few weeks ago, which was definitely outside my wheelhouse, and Chad Rimmer answered it really well, and I had to go look up things afterwards, so feel free to put me on the spot.
I know this is slightly out of your field, but since we don't have Webb Miller here to ask these questions, where are we in sequencing the genome for the woolly mammoth?
That is a great question. Yeah, so for people who haven't kept up with that news story, there's a company called Colossal Biosciences that's attempting to resurrect the woolly mammoth, and somebody who works at that company called Beth Shapiro used to be a professor at Penn State, funnily enough, so it's a small world in science. They have started getting information about the genome sequence of the mammoth. I would hypothesize that the hard part is not so much getting that information, but constructing that information into an intact genome, right, which is many chromosomes that are very long and complex, and then getting that genome into something like a denucleated elephant egg, and then producing a mammoth from that. However, I was in a seminar in the biology department the other week where there was a visiting professor who gave a talk about trying to sort of resurrect through breeding and sort of careful genomic selection a species of wolf called the red wolf, right? So this is hybridized, we think, with coyotes and other wolf species. And the idea is to sort of bring back, through conventional breeding programs, the red wolf. So I would maybe steer efforts like the effort to resurrect the woolly mammoth more in that way to do conservation of animals that did exist more recently than the mammoth. I don't know what we would do with the mammoth if we had it, to be honest, other than put it in a zoo and look at it. Yeah.
To me, the elephant in the room with all the genomic research
Hold your mic up.
and the potential revitalization of species that are extinct is, when do you draw the line? I mean, right now we're talking about the woolly mammoth. That's 20,000, 40,000, 100,000 years ago. What about the dinosaurs? Do we draw the line and not bring back dinosaurs? I mean, I understand the woolly mammoth, you could change the ecosystem somewhat in the Arctic and maybe it would survive. Where would you put the dinosaurs? On a remote island in the Pacific? And why would you do it? Where do you draw the line in terms of bringing back species? I understand studying the genome, you may find things that would determine what would make a species extinct or adaptable or things like that. And that all sort of makes sense. But actually bringing them back, that's a question. And I think Pastor Hetrick might say, aren't you really playing God if you make those decisions as to what species are going to be brought back? Because after all, didn't God make them extinct?
These are good questions, and I again will say I'm not an ethicist, although I do think about the ethical implications of my own research. That's part of the reason I'm a plant biologist rather than an animal biologist, by the way. There are fewer ethical concerns with harvesting plants versus, sacrificing animals for research. But from a practical perspective, there is no current evidence that we can actually obtain intact dinosaur DNA, right? That Jurassic Park was a science fiction-y movie, right? And getting the DNA out of a mosquito that's trapped in amber is not technically possible as far as we know right now. Mm-hmm. Could we potentially reconstruct what the dinosaur genome might have looked like? Possibly. But what would we do with that information? Because there have been 65 million years of other evolution of other species, that would make it very difficult to find, let's say, a host for gestating a dinosaur, even if you were able to create
a Komodo dragon.
Yeah, Komodo dragons are different from dinosaurs, and
yeah, I know.
The closest thing to dinosaurs right now are actually birds. Birds evolved, we think, from a lineage of dinosaurs. I think it's pretty unlikely that that will happen. I won't say it's impossible because there are a lot of things in science that we've said might not be possible that have ended up being possible. We have to be careful with the power that we gain through biotechnology and the learning that we do.
How about a plant-related question?
Great.
In all those things that you mentioned in terms of the sustainability of plants and how they actually function, What would you point your finger at in terms of the loss of the American chestnut, based on a question I asked last week? What is the most likely culprit that has taken down the American chestnut?
In many cases, it's disease, right?
Just
So
disease.
diseases have been introduced into different continents, right, where plants did not encounter those diseases over evolutionary time, and they have not developed resistance to those diseases. One analogy I'll use is that when Europeans first came to North America, Europeans had developed immunity to many of the diseases that they carried, or at least partial resistance. The Native American populations that existed in North America at the time did not have resistance to many of those diseases, and many of them died because of that. So similar things might be happening with some of the tree populations around the world. We're all aware of spotted lanternflies as being both a pest in themselves and harming trees, and also a potential vector for plant diseases. So if you see a spotted lanternfly, feel free to squish it. You will not have any ethical problems with that, from me at least.
If you had to give us kind of like a mission in the world as far as how we can kind of help relay this to other people, obviously not being a plant scientist, but I have found here, at Grace and through talks like this, that loving creation and loving God are not two mutually exclusive things, that they very much function together, and just finding ways to help people that might not understand climate change, or how to both love God and love creation. What kind of homework would you give us, or tell people that might be trying to find that mutual respect and grace?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a good amount of literature about creation care and stewardship of our planet. The Bible does command us, humans, to care for the other species that we coexist with on this planet. And I view sustainability as part of that mission. The other thing I would point out is that sustainability, in many ways, is about people. It is not about necessarily protecting nature at the expense of people's livelihoods or people's ability to live. It is about finding a balance where people and nature can both thrive. I imagine myself walking through, let's say, Rothrock Forest, and all the trees being dead. It would make me sad, right? And I view that personally as a sign that, when things are thriving in nature, that's a sign that God is there, and that we and God are maybe working together to support natural beauty and thriving. And again, these are my own words, not a theologian, so that's just my take. It's using the Arboretum as an example, just being able to appreciate plants. I'll tell you one secret. When I was an undergraduate biology major, I thought plants were boring. And it's because I hadn't looked at them under a microscope yet. It turns out that when you look at plant cells under a microscope, everything is moving around really fast. And I didn't realize that. So sometimes it takes just a little bit closer look to appreciate the beauty of nature and the evidence of God's love in that creation.
Once again, my goodness, y'all have great questions, and this is fabulous. Let's say thank you first.
Thank you. And you can find me any Sunday to ask questions. So.
There you go. And so I was thinking, sort of to wrap up where we are, as someone who's not a scientist but wishes that I could be, and is sort of a theologian. But I was thinking about two things, and the first of which is when you were talking about the superwood, and you were talking about concrete and the amount of greenhouse gases that are created in the process of making concrete. One of the things that we're experiencing in the world right now is an excessive amount of greenhouse gases are being released because buildings are being bombed that are concrete. I don't know if anybody's thought about that or not, but if you look at places where conflict is happening in the world, places like Ukraine and others, Gaza, when concrete buildings are destroyed, all of the encapsulated gases are released into the atmosphere to the point where they can be seen in imagery above our planet at the present time. which is really horrible. I heard that on NPR and I just wanted to pull off the road and cry. But at the same time, the fact that there is the possibility to replace what has been destroyed with something new that is a sustainable understanding of creation, like superwood, is resurrection. It's resurrection. We can't undo harm that may have already been done, but we have the possibility of resurrection. And the gift of science allows us, at least those of us that have the skill to use science, to help guide us in how God might be showing us how new life is possible in ways that we didn't know it before, because I'm pretty sure that people who have had their things bombed would like to have their things rebuilt, and we would like to be reclaiming and restoring creation in the process. So when I was listening to you talk about the concrete and the superwood, it came together for me that that's a story of death and resurrection as we have the ability to see it in the world today. And at the same time, and this is when we were going down the woolly mammoth road, I was starting to think about the dystopian novel I'm writing in my head about AI right now, where I don't really like the ending. There is so much in the world right now that people are struggling with knowing whether the content that is before us is in fact real. You know, if I see something on the news, is it real? If I see a picture, is it real? If I hear a story, is it real? The one thing I can assure you is absolutely real is what you look at when you walk right outside these doors. And you see the beauty of creation. And we see the beauty of one another. Every single one of us and everything that God created is sacred. The things that are right in front of us are sacred. And they're real. Now, people who are like teenagers and like 20 years old now will say, when you feel like the world is spiraling, go outside and touch grass. That turns out to be a really good thing to say. Look at what is real. Remind yourself of what is real and right before us, that we can both appreciate and we can protect, we can love and we can share. And that's one way that we can speak into the space of science and faith and what it means to make sense of the world in which we live right now. So I encourage you to do that. This coming Sunday, if you're here for worship, we're going to be celebrating stewardship of creation. That's our theme this Sunday. If you want to bring pictures of pets, other creatures, pictures you've taken of creation. I know a lot of you are really good photographers out there. Your social media accounts have shown me a lot of your work. I'm not going to look too hard at any one of you. We're going to gather those up here on risers at the altar at each of our services so we can remember that everything that God has created is sacred. It belongs at the altar because it's a sign of holiness, just as much as we are sacred and holy to God. So, with that, two things. Next week is our last week. We're going to hear about Lutheran advocacy ministry in Pennsylvania, and we're going to have a blessing of creation service to sort of close out our time together. So there will be a small opportunity for singing, but it will be singing under our own steam, so get your voices ready, but it will be songs that you know. And we're going to think about how we are called to act now that we've been given the gift of all of this time, and how we can praise God for what we are able to be a part of. So we're going to close with a prayer that was given to me tonight, actually, thank you. It is an Earth Communion prayer from Sojourners magazine from June. It is from the Earth Eucharist, adapted by Stephen Blackner, and it is in the Sojourners issue. It is called An Earth Communion Prayer. O God of abundance, our God of abundance has fed us with the bread of life and cup of love. With deep appreciation and thanks for the communion we share with each other and with the earth, we pray. Eternal Spirit, Earth Maker, Life Giver, Pain Bearer, Source of all that is and ever shall be, you have showered us with abundance. With the food we need for today, feed us. For the hurt we cause, forgive us. As we lose our way, restore us. Enlarge within us the sense of fellowship with all living creatures, all part of the family of God. Tune our hearts to live in harmony with Christ, with the earth, with all creatures, and with our human neighbors too, now and forever. Amen. Friends, go in peace. We'll see you next week. Peace, friends who are watching. Take care. Thank you, Charlie.